In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society, and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting, and welcome to the Ash Cloud. Today we are joined by Harry Lawson, Australia's largest Angus seed stock breeder. Lawson Angus runs properties in Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia and New South Wales and sells 1,000 bulls annually across Australia. Harry and his team focus on a whole farm systems approach to sustainability with a particular emphasis on reducing the emissions from breeding cows.
It's the methane load from the breeding flock or the herd is the biggest factor. About 70% of the costs associated with the breeding herd relate to feed. The methane output is directly correlated with that intake.
Unconventional thinking is needed.
In cattle breeding, the way to do that is to actually have moderate cows that are very energy efficient, very fertile, that are they're by definition more drought tolerant. So bigger cows really struggle to reach their intakes in those tough years.
An understanding of the system is critical to developing solutions that have real impact.
Having the best cattle genetics, but not having their rumen develop properly at a young age, is contradictory. Like adding a little bit of starch in those animals' diet when they're young has a massive change in their lifetime rumen development and feed efficiency. And I think the same goes at the other end of the animal's lifespan. If we can take out some of that seasonality.
Sustainability includes profitability.
If we can show farmers, demonstrate that these things are aligned with economics, they're all over it. Because farmers have got to find productivity changes. To be sustainable, you've got to be profitable.
Many opportunities are already available.
There's a lot of really good knowledge in agriculture. You look at all the grazing work was done in New Zealand in the 60s, 70s, 80s. That's not applied across 90% of the farms in Australia at the moment.
We can learn a lot from the next generation.
My kids are at school at Melbourne and they started to come back from school to say, Dad, you're destroying the environment, and beef cattle, we're sort of climate change is very much part of what the kids are taught at school, which is great. But really, they were sort of feeling like getting almost knocked around because they're beef producers, and that made me think. They were asking me really tough questions, like how much carbon dioxide do we produce? How much water per kilo of beef? And I tried to bluff my way around those questions for a while, and I realised I didn't actually have the answers to a level that would satisfy them or me, and it got me thinking. So I started to really dig into that deeper to initially to give them the answers, and I realised pretty quickly that it was complex too, and some of the answers that I got were really not what I expected.
Harry, thank you very much for joining me. If you could start by giving us a bit of an outline on where you see the greatest challenges and opportunities for sustainability in your industry.
Oh, thanks, Ash. Thanks for having me on too. Appreciate the opportunity, and pretty humble when you look at some of the other speakers that you've had before me. So hopefully I can do it some justice. That's a tough question to start with. I guess I see lots of opportunities in agriculture, and it's certainly in my career, this is the best time from a financial point of view that it's good to actually be able to look forward and set the business up for the next tough periods, but also it's a good opportunity to think and review what we're currently doing and where we need to head.
So in terms of the challenges around sustainability that are out there that you're hearing, and also differences in the conversations you're having with the different people you speak with on a regular basis, be they people in the cities or your customers or people up and down the value chain, what are you hearing?
It's like, I guess where my journey started, long time ago in terms of farming, but where my kids are at school at Melbourne, and they started to come back from school to say, Dad, you're destroying the environment, and beef cattle, we're sort of climate change is very much part of what the kids are taught at school, which is great. But really, they were sort of feeling like getting almost knocked around because they're beef producers, and that made me think. They were asking me really tough questions like how much carbon dioxide do we produce, how much water per kilo of beef, and I tried to bluff my way around those questions for a while, and I realised I didn't actually have the answers to a level that would satisfy them or me, and it got me thinking. So I started to really dig into that deeper to initially to give them the answers, and I realised pretty quickly that it was complex too, and some of the answers that I got were really not what I expected. So I think you have, one of my early meetings when I started to look into it was with Professor Bill Malcolm at Melbourne Uni and Richard Eckard, and those two were really good in helping me sort of build a framework of how I was going to investigate, the issues of sustainability, carbon change, what are actually those key drivers on the farm that we control, what are the big influences in a beef cattle business. And Richard's knowledge was really valuable too, because I thought it was, the majority or the big chunk of the answer was going to be in the soils. And soil, we know, is no doubt soils by a mass, they're having a healthy soil is everything. So I'm not, by no way take what I'm saying as dismissive of soil carbon and having healthy soils, but it's not in a beef cattle business. When you look at that's where someone like Bill Malcolm, when you look at the whole farm approach, you can't just look at one aspect, and that's probably the thing that I think is challenging in farming, that one part or very passionate about one part of the business. There's people out there that are just hugely passionate about regen ag and soils and soil carbon. There's people that are some of the best plant breeders in the world, and there's some people that are really grazing systems, and then there's the animals genetics. So it's actually, there's very few people that really understand the whole system, and that's the challenge that I think is the biggest thing for farmers, is really as Ash, like it's a really complex biological system, farming. If you look at all those components we just talked about, to be actually knowledgeable and across all those facets of farming, including just the economics of running a business and the human resources, like the people side of it is one of our biggest challenges. Farming is getting people, skilled people in that bring something to the business. So there's lots of challenges there. But anyway, that it's probably, I should thank my kids for really giving me a good kick up the backside and making me get motivated to look into to this. So that was probably 5 years ago. Since then, we've made a lot of changes. We've reviewed every part of the business and continue to do that. So I guess when you look at, to me, there's a very different perception. The question you asked about what are people saying, I think the big drive for climate change is really coming from the city. Like I think the perception of consumers and their of beef as being a major contributor to global warming, to me, is really alarming. That's the stuff that's what's going to change the way we do things. It's the kids, the next generation of consumers, that they want to know that they're very environmentally conscious. I mean, you talk about some of these kids really do have, I shouldn't laugh about it, it's a serious thing. They have, eco anxiety. So they're the ones that are going to change the way they shop. And I went to the US, had a really good trip to the US this year, before COVID, when I try and go to the Beef Improvement Federation conference every few years, which is a really good thrash out of beef cattle research, whether it's meat science or genetics. And this whole sustainability issue wasn't even really on the agenda 3-4 years ago. It's really more coming from countries like Australia and New Zealand. We were pushing it faster than what was happening in the US, which I was quite surprised, because normally, where you live, California is on the front end of those consumer trends generally in these type of environmental areas. So I was surprised that it wasn't really high on the agenda a few years back, but it certainly was this year, and there were some good speakers, around that topic. And one of the main speakers, from the Global Roundtable Sustainable Group, made the point that we've really got to we've got to start measuring and be more transparent with consumers. And I think that certainly is the way we approach things. Like, we like measuring things and being accountable in our genetics program. That's fundamental to our business, is being accountable to our clients and being transparent, and really measuring things. Data is the only way you can really be accountable to consumers, and it's the same on our genetics with our commercial clients. I think we can solve and measure these things, with scientific principles rather than rhetoric and sort of feel-good type approaches.
How are you seeing the alignment or lack of alignment between the conversations you're having, say, with your children and their friends, compared with conversations on the same topic with customers or other people within the industry? Do you see alignment? Do you see change? Do you see there still being a divide there?
Yeah, massive divide. I think they're just totally different worlds. And some, where I guess we sell bulls all over Australia, so we have clients in very diverse parts of Australia as well. One of the things that I thought when I started this journey, if I start banging on about climate change, a lot of my clients will think, oh geez, Harry's become a real tree hugger here and lost the plot. And so we've got to be careful not the technical side of improving emissions intensity is actually quite technical, and you can bore people to tears when you start sort of getting into sort of methane discussions. But I think, and on the flip side, I think the city people, they're hearing a lot. All they're hearing in the media is very negative images. Their perception of beef cattle is that they're, farting, which they don't even fart to the methane, that they're just every day blowing this, planet up. So the perception is, I think, that meat is really a massive contributor to global warming, and I think we should just talk about the relative contribution of beef cattle in a global context, and then break that down to the Australian context, because it's, the perception is very different to the reality, I guess.
I think lamb is a really easy example here, because if you have a lamb that comes from as a set of triplets, all the emissions and all the environmental footprint of that mother, of that ewe, is divided by 3. Whereas if you have a lamb or a bit of lamb that you buy from the supermarket that comes from a farm with a low lambing percentage below 100%, then the actual percentage of emissions from the mothers is much, much greater, just because of the environment, the context. So you see those two pieces of those two chops on the shelf, and how do you know the difference between one that is much more efficiently and has produced and has a much lower footprint than the other? And so if you summarize or don't go into the detail enough, you lose all that nuance, and then you lose the ability to allow people to make the right choices.
Yeah, I really like that analogy you used with the with the
I
sheep.
know,
And
I know talking to a cattle stud guy about lambs is probably heresy. It's just
funny you say that, because most of my genetics training, because I'd studied at Lincoln University, was in sheep, and I've actually just started a sheep program to do exactly what you're talking about. So I've had always had a passion for breeding sheep, and genetics is I've started a shedding sheep program at Lincoln University. We would study the Brawler gene, which is a high fecundity gene that they were putting in coopworse at the time, and so basically boosts your land. It's a single gene effect. There is some additive effect if you have two copies. If you homozygous, there is some secondary boost. But at the time at Lincoln, the whole lamb industry crashed, so no one was interested in actually getting twins. But that gene's actually been infused in some hair sheep here. So I'm actually building and registered a brand called Low Carbon Lamb, and we are going to start. Was the start of the genetics program there. So crossing Dorpers with Aussie whites and these high fecundant sheep. So you're exactly right. Sheep's the easiest one to solve. The thing that I think those factors we're talking about, the exciting thing for me is, as a geneticist, there's lots of things we can do with sheep and cattle. But the alignment with economics is the exciting thing as well. That's what I think I really wanted to talk to you about today, is that, the conversation we're having with farmers, if we can show farmers, demonstrate that these things are aligned with economics, they're all over it, because farmers have got to find productivity changes. To be sustainable, you've got to be profitable. So to me, genetics is just an input into their farming system, into their business. So if you can help drive their profitability, productivity, and at the same time you're improving their sustainability, reducing their methane intensity, and improving their soils, their pasture production, your pasture utilisation. If you're doing all those things in tandem, you can make some huge changes, and possibly they're not even thinking about the environment per se, but they're actually making some huge steps. So that's why I think, it's funny to talk about the sheep, and I don't know whether to mention, get sidetracked on that, but it's just, if you take that principle, Ash, about you're 100% right in that load of it's the methane load from the breeding flock or the herd is the biggest factor. Like, there's a common number we use in agriculture that about 70% of the costs associated with a breeding herd relate to feed. So if you think of, and a sheep enterprise would be similar. So the other next part of that is that animals, so most of that is going to maintenance for cows, right? And a cow, generally in a maintenance situation, depending on her body size, they go from a maintenance level of about 7 or 8 kilograms a day to peak lactation. They need about 12 or 13 kilograms. So that's a relative change. But what's important is that the methane output is directly correlated with that intake. So, if you go back, say, well, in a farming business, 70% of your costs is about feed, but then all your methane outputs are related to intake as well. So if you have 100 cows and only 50 carb, their methane load per unit of body kilos produced is horrible. And that's the same point about the sheep. If you get triplets, and that you can sustain those triplets, and she can get in lamb every year, that's the way to reduce your emissions intensity. So I'm a little bit frustrated as a geneticist in the sense that the actual vast majority of producers in Australia don't understand that really basic point, in the sense that the cows are getting bigger and bigger, and in the north, fertility is getting worse. So the adapted breeds like your Brahmins, Sounders, Drought Masters, been it's focused on growth instead of fertility. So in actual fact, they're harder to get in calf than they were 20 years ago. So a lot of breeders are, there's a lot of very progressive breeders there as well. So, I don't want to offend anyone that is doing different things, because there are some really progressive large and small scale breeders on the other end of it. But that's really where the big opportunity change in Australia is, because that's where most of the Boss Indicus cattle, that's where the fertility issues. I mean, I think there's about 23 million cattle in Australia, 10 million in Queensland. So if we're talking about, making fundamental change, that's where the big opportunity for change in fertility is. In the south, the worrying factor is these cows are getting bigger and bigger too. So in plant breeding, we've got to focus on sustainability, making them more insect tolerant, more drought tolerant. In cattle breeding, the way to do that is to actually have moderate cows that are very energy efficient, very fertile, that are they're by definition more drought tolerant. So bigger cows really struggle to reach their intakes in those tough years. So their reproductive crash in droughts is much bigger than more moderate cows, just by mere fact of their intakes. So they're really easy things to actually measure and monitor, but they're not being picked up. And it's not just Australia, the US. Like I have a joke with my American, you guys are too wealthy. You can you can afford the feed bills. We have to make this business work. So we have a bit of banter. But so really, if you want to talk emissions, that to me, like, it's like, go back to that conversation I had with Bill Malcolm and Richard Eckhart. Like, get your act together in terms of priorities. What's in your business? And to me, the things that I've learned from cattle genetics is cow size drives everything. So you can run more cows per hectare if they're more moderate, more fertile. So milk is probably the other thing. Like, milk is actually a very energy dense product and is a big draw on the cow's energy. So milk is a big factor. So I struggle to keep the genetic potential of milk in our beef cattle moderate, because the global trend's getting more and more, think more and more milk is better, but it's actually a big energy drain, which in turn drives intake and drives methane output.
Yeah. And it also could drive weight loss, which could lead to lower fertility if there wasn't enough feed, or the feed quality wasn't as high as it needed to be.
Yeah, no, you hit it. You're spot on, Ash. And that's probably the observation I had when we had, we had years of drought in a farm in Western Australia in a row, and you go into groups of 150 cows that all have the same opportunity from birth, and you look at why some are really absolutely struggling, some are okay, and some are cruising. And because we have 50 years of breeding records and statistics on all these cows, so it was hard when I tried to analyse it statistically, but the observation was that a lot of those moderate cows that were high milk were the poorest cows in the group. So definitely, they got pregnant, lactated. A lot of that body weight went into the calf, through the lactational drag. Didn't get an opportunity to recover body weight before the next lactation, and so by the end of that next lactation, they look like a scarecrow. And a lot of those cows then fall out of the system if you have restricted breeding seasons like we do. So our cows have to conceive in the same 45-day window every year. So running those cows under pressure tests is the only way you really, you keep some checks and balances on those sort of traits.
And that also feeds back into the whole lifetime emissions, because if you've got a cow that, say, had it takes 2 years to raise a cow from a calf to when she has her her first calf, and if she only breeds for 4 years, then the actual raising of the calf is a third of a life. Whereas if she breeds for 10 years or 8 years, say, then it's 20% of a life. So you have a dilution factor by keeping her in the herd for longer.
Yeah, there's that part of it. I have a slightly different view. Like, longevity is important, there's no doubt, but the other way to actually look at it from emissions ash is there's like calving every year is essential. There's no doubt about it. But the other point about having that there is there's some new technology coming out with the genomic selection of heifers, and some consultants and even the Breed Society have so recommending that if you have 100 heifers, you go through and DNA test them and select the best 50 to retain, and the other 50 is sold. My view is really is if you have the right bull inputs, those 100 heifers should be side by very high quality bulls. Those 100 heifers will be a superior model to your 6-7 year old cows. So if I'm doing my job each year, your genetics get better. So from a genetic point of view, the only way to make genetic progress is really to have a faster turn off in your cows. So those 7 or 8 year old cows, maybe sell them to other farmers, or they go to slaughter. So that's my view, that people, if you spend money on bulls and they are more energy efficient, for example, and as well as doing other things, including meat quality, then the only way to retain that genetic progress is by retaining heifers.
That I think the big thing about this is that very little is black and white. And
the other point, sorry to interrupt, but just on that methane, is that by keeping young heifers, every day you have an animal that is very efficient to feed compared to, eats less than an old cow, and she's a rising value. So your old cows are really at a static value and a static body weight. So there isn't methane. The most profitable beef system is what they call a once bred heifer system, where you actually mate heifers, join them, and then you sell the heifer and grow the calf out. So that's actually very efficient from an economic and a methane perspective when you map that out. So that, again, economics and whole environmental equations, look at the whole farm system, are tied together.
In terms of, I think we've discussed a number of relatively straightforward ways where you can have a real impact. I think from my conversation with Professor Richard Eckhart, he said that you could probably cut emissions by 15% by making relatively simple, relatively low-cost changes. What do you see missing in terms of getting the message across to producers that these changes are straightforward, they will likely result in higher profitability, and where do you see, I guess, opportunities to actually have that change implemented on the ground?
That's a really good question. It's because the science is there. You're 100% right, and you've got when you hear people like Richard and Bill Malcolm talk, you think, well, that's just so obvious. We need to implement that, but change is pretty slow on a farm level. So I don't we don't, as an industry, we don't have much of an extension resource like they do in the US now. That a lot of that's been disbanded. So I think my big hope, Ash, to be honest, is the next generation of farmers. I think there's been a real void in terms of smart young people coming into agriculture. It's been a horrible industry for 20, 30 years, in terms of economics. So all those smart kids were always told to go off to uni and do anything but go farming. So the most exciting thing for me is to see like the interest that really want to pull things apart. So that's probably, we've really got to encourage that, get this next generation properly trained, in the rigors of science and economics. So, if you could clone the Richard Eckards and Bill Malcolms, you need to get these guys teaching for another 20 years. But so really drill in, get the basic science sort of education, but also really the universities and the applied side of it play a big role in making sure that they see perspective. So I think that's probably going to be because there's a lot of misunderstanding and that disconnect we're talking about between city and urban. So we're going to need really well-educated leaders in the rural community to tackle these issues. So the only other way, I guess, it's a slow burn. It's frustrating with the genetics. You sort of have those that get it and those that don't. And the sad thing is, just from a beef cattle point of view, the only thing really correlated with saleable price is sale weight. So there's not actually a strong understanding of genetics, even though it's actually the easiest thing to fix in your business. So, like to me, genetics is just an input like fertilizer or seed, or it's a key component in that mix. So I think we just need to stay on the path. We need to do, like us animal breeders need to do a better job in Australia communicating these simple messages. Like some of these messages that there's the focus on emissions intensity. Some of the seed stock guys are actually selling it to their clients like faster calves grow quicker, they get to market quicker, so they have lower emissions. And certainly that's true. Turning cattle off at a younger age reduces their methane intensity, but they're ignoring the fact that if those mama cows are 800 kilos, that's the big carbon load that we talked about. So you can't just sort of pick a sector and say, well, these calves grow really fast, so they're energy efficient. Yet they've got these huge thumping big cows in the background that they're not talking about. So it's having that whole farm approach. So I guess my view in terms of the whole farm approach is that if you look at our clients, we have a lot of really progressive clients that are very good at grazing. And most of them have very good soil carbon levels because grazing management and pasture management go hand in hand. So I think their farming systems are as a whole really good. Those more progressive grazing people have got. So there's not really, as sort of Richard Eckhart pointed out to me, there's probably not a huge increase in soil carbon they can make. I think the change for them and the change for me is that as an ag industry, we became too reliant, too addictive on nitrogen to boost our productivity. I think that was an area that both Bill and Richard hammered me on early on, the relative importance of nitrous oxide. So I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can on the beef cattle genetics, but it's a bit hypocritical if I've got the most energy efficient livestock genetics, but I'm doing a shocking job in terms of, my soils and piling nitrogen on to grow grass. So I think, to me, let's develop really good grazing systems, look after our soil, nitrogen efficiency, less reliant on big dumps of granular fertilizer, more strategic foliar applications. My New Zealand uncle, he's a plant scientist at Lincoln. He came over a few years ago and was belting me for using nitrogen in the spring. He made the point, let the legumes do the job, Harry. And I think we were growing too much monoculture ryegrass and had dropped out the legume component. So there's having deep-rooted perennials and having legumes in our system, there's a really easy one. Not easy, but there's an obvious one. So again, the more progressive farmers are doing, we're looking at those things. Like Bevan Ravenhill's one of our cooperators in Western Australia, probably one of the best grass managers in Australia. Like, he's an example of he's changed his whole system to foliar applications, incorporating some biological farming systems, and combination of using some nitrogen fertilizer. But there's an example where I think people like him, he's a leader in the agriculture sector, and he's a good influence on people like us and other farmers. So that's how I think farmers change when you get you see these things working in your own environment. And to me, I want to make sure there's a scientific basis for those changes. So that's what I think. The number you talk about, 15%. I think by changing 4 or 5 things, I think 30% is a very easy target. It's if you implement those basic changes, you're going to really fundamentally change your emissions intensity equation. So soils, pastures, fertilizer, and then beef genetics is an easy one. The big one I missed out, Ash, which is close to you, is obviously nutrition, like ruminant nutrition. We haven't even talked about that, and you're a poor salesman, Ash. But it is.
I'm here to listen to you, mate.
But you probably get, for us, the same thing. A lot of these, like having that rumen tick. Like, to me, it's the same thing. Having the best cattle genetics, but not having their rumen develop properly at a young age, is contradictory. Like, you've got to have them going together. So, I think the work that you and Proagny are doing on the feed additives to develop that rumen, I'm really excited about where that's going. And see, that's an easy one to build into your system. So the northern guys, for example, they do that really well. The early weaning, they're getting much better at developing, to maintain cow body weight. They pull calves off, they handle them. They're much better at the stock handling, low stress stock handling principles. So although I was saying there's opportunity, the bits they're probably missing are more the genetics. But yeah, the rumen development, and that's probably the other thing I think in terms of your system, your farming system. There at one stage there was almost an anti-grain feeding. The push was for organic and pasture fed. If we look at the change going on in New Zealand, it's phenomenal, isn't it? Like, the environmental is a huge change going on there. But I do question in New Zealand some of that, the regen stuff coming out of New Zealand. Some of that lacks science. Mm-hmm. And I also think we shouldn't get too hung up on just pushing pasture fed, because the feed additives that you're developing with Proagny, adding a little bit of starch in those animals' diet when they're young, has a massive change in their lifetime rumen development and feed efficiency. And I think the same goes at the other end of the animal's lifespan. If we can take out some of that seasonality and improve the quality of their diet at various times, so instead of a drought, the end of the spring, some of their live weight gains fall to 0.2, 0.5 a kilo. If you can add a little bit of starch and improve the quality of their diet, you can have those animals, gaining at 1.2, 1.5 kilos. You're getting much higher meat quality, and you're turning them off at a younger age. So that I do think, to me, and some of that can still be silage-based diet, but But if we want to look at an animal's lifetime performance, to me, the big factors are, developing a ruminant weaning and developing a production system which keeps those animals growing, keeps them healthy for their life, and keeps them growing at a certain rate. So they're the big things that I probably see that, and that's what I spend a lot of more time talking to clients and learning a lot on the way about tweaking those production systems.
Would you say it's the need for a more, I guess, sophisticated adaptive production system than existed in the past?
Yeah. For a guy that lives in the US, Ash, you're all over this production stuff. That's a really good question. I think that's exactly what we're doing as a group of farmers. If I look at our change, it's going on nationally. I think the common thing is we're definitely building more drought tolerant production systems. So one of the most obvious things there is a containment area. In every farm basically that has any, intensification is a way to improve productivity. So if you look at a global sense, we've got to produce, 3 times as much food to feed this global population. And I actually have a really strong belief, and we can do it on, virtually a lot of farms in Australia. We can triple their productivity and be more sustainable. And that's the other thing I get worked up about is some of the plant-based messages coming out that we're destroying the plant intensification of livestock. I actually think with modern farming systems, we can really improve productivity and the amount of food in a more sustainable way by implementing some of these basic changes that we're talking about. So increased production does not need to be deforestation or destroying our environment. And I think that next generation of farmers will be even better than us in that regard. So containment area, if you're going to intensify, again, Bill Malcolm was talking at a field day that I didn't attend, but I saw some of the information saying that it's key to improving productivity, but also you build in, it increases your risk. So intensification can go either way. You need a higher level of management, but you also can destroy your environment pretty quickly with intensification if it's not done right. So having a more robust business, I think, containment area, what that does is enable you to maintain your core breeding stock throughout any drought, or even to smooth out those variable parts of the season. So routinely now, so for example, the smaller farm where I live, when we basically utilise all our grass, get down to an acceptable ground cover, usually by Christmas time. Those cattle then come off the hills, and those pastures are all in resting phase until it rains in the autumn. The old way was to really leave those animals out, maybe at a much lower stocking rate, but nevertheless they were still out there grazing all summer. And if I stand on the hills behind me and look 50 k's every way, all those hills have been destroyed over the last 100 years from overgrazing. And a big part of the topsoil on those hills is in the river systems, just from poor grazing management. So containment area, again, it's then the farmer's choice. It's your choice how hard you graze and what pasture cover you leave. So
you take them off the hills and you put them in the containment area, and then you feed them with whatever feed they need, and that's probably a mixture of forages and silages and grains, depending on the economics of it at any particular time and the animal's needs.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, it's probably the New Zealand system I was trained in. You tend to take some of that spring surplus that you can't eat and conserve that as silage is a really we tend to make pit silage. So yeah, and then again, you do a least cost ration. You use other, whether it's feed straw hay just to maintain, because generally those animals, well, certainly the breeding females, are just in maintenance mode then. So the same applies. We're just developing a breeding herd in New South Wales. We just bought a farm there last year. So it's a flat floodplain. So containment area works equally as well there, that if we have those animals, and it's got, 30% of that farm is bush. And even that bush is a very fragile ecosystem. So when we took over, it was all, there was a lot of logging going on. The kangaroos had overgrazed it. So even though we love having kangaroos around and we maintain a population, just being able to control how we manage that bush in a sustainable way, as well as the grazing areas, is a really good challenge for us, and an opportunity to sort of set that farm up that it's highly productive but also sustainable. We want to fence all those waterways, rivers off where we can, so you haven't got these nutrient loads going into the water system. We want to control the amount of wildlife, and we want to strategically graze the sensitive areas, but also have intensive grazing systems on our productive systems so we can grow a lot of feed and utilize it. But again,
one thing I'm noticing is that a lot of the strategies or management practices you're speaking about end up being win-wins. I would suspect that if you've rested that hill pasture rather than overgrazed it when it's dry, that it actually would come back much faster when it gets a shower of rain on it and grow more grass for the rest of the year. And likewise with not having the nutrients going into the river systems, you're actually maintaining those nutrients on your property so they can go back into the soil and produce healthier pastures going forward. So is that creating the win-wins part of the strategy?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Definitely that those, that comes back to keeping your soils healthy too, doesn't it? This hill country, it's amazing how much feed we grow on these hills. So nutrient recycling, that's probably in terms of intensive grazing, that's a big part of it too. You get a more even distribution of nutrients. Typically in the hill country, or even in the flats, the stock, if you just set stock them in big areas, the nutrients will get dragged back to their stock camp where they like to sit under a tree or on a river. And for example, the answer is absolutely yes, because you've got more organic matter in those soils too. The plants, even those perennial plants, that they look dead in the summer. You think, well, and there's new varieties of cocksfoot and phalaris and things which are more animal friendly, but also drought tolerant. And if you manage those perennials, same as lucerne, if you graze them and then rest them over the summer, they kick away in the autumn.
In terms of the broader changes across the industry, you've mentioned a number of times getting more younger people out there and giving them the reins to a certain extent so they can actually drive the changes that they're learning about, and also what their generation is passionate about and sees the critical issues. But in terms of if you had your wish list of resources, people, programs to actually drive those messages, where do you see, what would you do if I gave you the blank checkbook, so to speak, to drive change in this space?
That's a challenging question, but it's to me, it's actually right where we sit at the moment is even if funding this stuff ourselves, because the industry is booming at the moment, for the first time we actually have some decisions around what we're going to invest in, and people is the first thing that we're looking at. Like this week we've had two external people that we're looking engaging for training and to build our capabilities of people in terms of the economy and pastures and management systems. So I think where if you look at the blank check, it's probably investing in people and systems to make sure we all learn and grow together, but also very much looking at how we can software programs, technology to bring into the business too. So for example, we're looking at soil carbon biodiversity projects in New South Wales, but we've got to have systems to record and manage the data as well. So investment, and again, that involves people as well. So people and technology are a big part of our investment. Like I also want to double. We have a Vitality Grow Safe feed efficiency unit here. We have, so we can measure 80 bulls at once. I would love to, have the funds to double that, and also do, for example, more testing on feed additives, Ash, like the sort of stuff you do, where we can do trial replication. So as new products come online, like I'm someone that wants to see those and measure the difference before I really, build them into our system. So if I have, that research unit, if it's larger, I can have more flexibility to do more trials and replication. So that's another area that I'm really interested in. But a lot of what we have to, so people, technology, we've also got to make sure our next generation get, farming's a tough business at the end of the day. That, my daughter's out there shifting bulls twice a day. It's horrible, muddy conditions. Technology farming's got to be, it's a tough business, like our New South Wales guys. It's just calving, getting out there every day, tagging calves. We're about to start AI. We've probably got 20,000 animal handlings in the next 6 weeks. You wear a lot of legs, a lot of people out. So even with technology, we've got to have kids that are resilient, tough, and understand the basics. So we sort of think, some people think in our industry, because we sell bulls and they come to the sale and it all looks very glamorous, but at the end of the day, I think there's still some components of farming where you've got to get on the end of a shovel and do that. So if I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it's a combination of engaging that next generation with technology, but also making sure that we don't skip a lot of the basics. As someone pointed out the other day, probably plagiarizing, I said, if you wait for a scientist to solve something, you'll be dead. There's a lot of really good knowledge in agriculture. You look at all the grazing work was done in New Zealand in the 60s, 70s, 80s. That's not applied across 90% of the farms in Australia at the moment. So we run the risk of this next generation. It's almost like a generational skip in terms of that basic production research, which is so fundamental to doing the things we're talking about, improved grazing. We've got to make sure they're not skipped for sexier technology like genomics is a good example. Like the next generation of geneticists like me, the risk is they make all their selection just based on genomics without actually understanding the production systems that these animals have got to live and thrive in. So it's a bit of a combination, but without that technology, you're not going to engage kids either. Well, not kids, they're not all kids, but that young generation. Like I think that's where the cropping guys, those, the young, they love the GPS, the high tech, the new technology in tractors or in livestock. A lot of kids got sick of dagging news and cheering, and like my kids with the grazing stuff. So like the technology like that feed efficiency work we're doing, it's pretty cool the both my kids have really played a big role in implementing that, and they see the differences in the animal intakes. They see that technology can really assist in their animal breeding. So when they're out there, they're not just out there shifting cattle and doing mundane, they're also engaged in the high tech stuff. And I think that keeps their minds active as well, and makes them think about things in a scientific, economic way. So that's probably the challenge, is making sure that we don't miss the basic applied stuff, but we keep looking at building new technology in where we can.
Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think you'd like to add?
I'm not sure if you've got anything else. The other one, I think, probably we've talked a lot about production. The other area we are working on is we've registered a low carbon beef brand, and we somehow want to find the space in our business, which is a challenge from a time and economic point of view. But we've done some really good trial work with that brand with consumers in Melbourne and some export programs, and the consumer uptake of that brand's been phenomenal, especially from a taste point of view. So I see we do have a really unique genetics plan here, and we have a lot of our farmers are just selling, they're getting averaged as a commodity. So I really think probably the missing link in our business is to connect with our brand to consumers. And that's the other reason I think we need to make sure that we're measuring the key things on farm, that we're transparent to those consumers. So that's a big challenge in a small business like ours. But that's so that's something we are looking at for the future part of the business. And the other part is that we are building some hybrid genetics. I spoke to you today, I'm looking at linking some of our US partners to building a global genetics system where we can pull genetics in from different parts of the world, evaluate them in so the more pastoral zones, and use that data to drive our genetics decisions. So I think that's another big area in terms of technology, the combinations of genomics, like global technology systems are going to play a big part in our decision making going forward. So this is probably a couple of things that I think the potential, the ability to move quicker and pull information from different parts of the world, has really come a long way. I mean, even the technology that we're using now, the ability to communicate with you, and so that's where I think probably our strength is really not getting is making sure that we're keeping abreast of what's going on in the rest of the world. And that's not easy when you're running an intensive business in its own right, but that's a connection and a commitment that we make to try and connect our clients to that global research base and global genetics base, and make sure that we're keeping up, which is a challenge, because there's some pretty smart people out there, as you know, but bringing those bits of research back into our businesses and applying them, and making sure that, for example, my son's going to go and study in New Zealand next year, and that'll open up a whole new network for him, but also those graduates that are going out doing some cool things will want to be learning some of the things that they're doing, and look forward to them coming back and applying some of those things in our business. So being part of a global food industry is probably what we see ourselves as, a tiny little player. We probably influence the population of 23 million cattle in Australia. It's small, the population of 1 billion cattle in the world is, it's insignificant. So you've got to keep perspective on things, but being a small player means we can move. We're pretty nimble, and as people learn things, we can build them into our business pretty quickly.
Awesome, mate. Thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Yeah, you too, Ash. Really, and I enjoy your podcast. I think that's probably the other good thing about that technology for learning, isn't it?
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Harry Lawson from Lawson Angus, recorded in California in August 2022.